Hi, I'm Julie Ross.
And I'm Gregory Abbey.
And you're listening to the Parenting Horizons podcast.
Julie is a longtime parent educator and counselor.
And Greg is an actor, writer, and director, and more importantly, a parent just like you.
Through conversations covering a range of different topics, challenges, and roadblocks, we hope to give you a few of Julie's tools that might just help make parenting a little bit easier.
Look, nobody's perfect, and parenting is challenging, to say the least. With a few skills under our belts, though, we might just be able to be good enough parents and enjoy the journey and our children a little bit more in the process.
Welcome back to the Parenting Horizons podcast. That was my professional rendition of our introduction. Did it sound okay?
Sounded great, Greg. Awesome.
Okay, perfect.
I loved it.
So, thank you. Julie and I are back just one-on-one for this recording. And we're remote. I'm in Michigan, actually, on vacation, and Julie's in New York City.
Still stuck in New York City.
Yes, but with the beauty of the internet, we can record together. So this week we are going to talk about anxiety. Is that what we're discussing generally, Julie?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Yeah, I really wanted to address this because for a couple of reasons. One is that, some research has come out recently that has said that there's been a significant rise in anxiety and depression diagnosed for children between the ages of 3 and 17.
Wow.
It's within the past 5 years that number has increased significantly.
So even before COVID, because obviously I know COVID upticked it, but 5 years, yeah.
Even before COVID. And I think there's a couple of reasons why that is happening. One, I think, is technology. I think that, younger and younger kids are being given technology, and the problem is that it takes away from kind of a natural anxiety reducer, which is physical exercise. And so you got that, you combine that with increased pressure in school, academic pressure in school, and the fact that schools have not entirely eliminated, but certainly decreased the amount of outdoor playtime or outdoor physical activity that kids have. So I think that's what it is. Then, that's a part of it. I think that's the reason that it was starting to increase before COVID. Then I think, there are a number of, we've talked about this on the podcast before, a number of kind of existential crises, if that is I don't know how existential they are. They feel pretty real to me, but
right.
You've got the COVID, you've got, the war in Ukraine, you've got the
gun violence,
the active shooter drills that kids are having to engage in. Now we've got the overturn of Roe v. Wade and other actions by the Supreme Court that feel very dangerous to marginalized communities. Of course, a 3-year-old's not going to know that, but a teenager certainly will.
Right.
So, the National Institute of Health estimates that 1 in 3 children will experience an anxiety disorder at some point between the ages of 13 and 18.
When you say anxiety disorder, do you mean something that continues for a long period of time? Is that how they're determining it, as opposed to like if your child has a panic attack one night, that's just an episode as opposed to a disorder?
So I'm not a diagnostician, but I think in lay people's terms, it's important to understand and differentiate between anxiety and an anxiety disorder.
Sure.
And anxiety is a feeling that everybody has from time to time, right? And
yes.
It's usually linked, right? It's
Yes.
usually linked. Yes, we can both agree on that.
We've all
right?
had it, sure. I have some personal experience.
Exactly. So anxiety is something that is linked to a specific situation, right? or circumstance that, can be seen and felt and heard and that kind of thing. And when it's quote unquote just anxiety, because it's linked to that specific circumstance, when we address that circumstance and move through it, the anxiety naturally drops off.
Mm-hmm.
An anxiety disorder, however, is not necessarily linked to a specific circumstance. And even if it is, it's something that lingers past when that resolution has happened.
Right. So if you're having anxiety from an event like, a child has a big school test the next day, or they're going to summer camp, and so there's going to be circumstances that come up that it's just sort of natural. And so do you have parents sometimes coming to you, like in the groups, that are maybe confused and wondering, when does this tip into something that is a more serious condition, or you might need some help or some therapy, or I'm assuming even in extreme cases, medication? Is that a question that parents have for you?
100%. And especially because of this uptick, in anxiety and anxiety-related disorders. Parents are seeing more anxious kids.
Mm-hmm.
And, the question to me is, how do I help my kid?
Right.
How do I help my kid through it? And it's a tricky question because I think, maybe even last year we did a podcast about the dangers of invalidating a child's feelings, that
Mm-hmm.
we talked about pull yourself up by your bootstraps and,
right.
Suck it up and be a man. And
sure.
And because it's difficult for parents to see their children in distress, I think it is a go-to reaction that parents have. Well, if you just study for your test, then you wouldn't be nervous about it, right? And that's kind of that suck it up mentality. The problem is that if a child's not studying for the test, they're not taking action, it creates an increase in anxiety and a decrease in both motivation and actionable steps. So we don't want, as parents, to adopt that philosophy with our kids. And we want to recognize that in order for kids to be resilient, they have to experience an emotion, be able to name that emotion, and then move through it and recognize that they've moved through it. In other words, that they're qualitatively different right now than they were 5 minutes ago, right?
Mm-hmm. So how do you help a child? How do you guide a child through those moments? So I get that you're saying, obviously, this sort of, just do it, just grind it out. You got this. Ignore those feelings. Sit down and do it. Obviously, you don't want to do that. But then, when is it also kind of enabling? It's a balance, right? Because you want them to work through it, but also be attentive to their experience and what they're going through.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it is definitely a balance, and I think really the first step is to validate the feelings. Mm-hmm. The first step is to say, either it seems like something triggered this anxiety. Like when it's a more generalized anxiety and they're just, running around the house like, I can't deal.
Freaking out, right.
Freaking out about something, which, as we both know, having children in the house as you do, or having had children in the house as
they're going to be
do.
Freaking out about something probably at some point.
Exactly. And they aren't necessarily going to be able to identify what that feeling is. That's what our job is as parents, is to be the emotional mirror to them. So just like when we get dressed in the morning, right, and we stand in front of a physical mirror to make sure that, we match and that there's no stains on our clothing or whatever, and we have that reflection to make that judgment. Kids need an emotional mirror as well, and that's where we come in. And I think what confuses people about anxiety is the concern that if we acknowledge the anxiety, that we are
It's gonna increase or become more of a problem, I imagine, right? Some parents think
Right.
that
Exactly.
if I
That
if I
it's going to
acknowledge these feelings, it's gonna make it worse.
right, exactly. And it doesn't. And parents may have to take a leap of faith from this podcast and just try it to ensure to experience the fact that it really doesn't make
Hmm.
it worse. It makes it manageable. And that's really important. It's really of critical importance because when anxiety becomes unmanageable, right? Then
Hmm.
that's when we get the anxiety disorder.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm assuming what determines that is it's repetitive, right? And it starts to affect their life.
Yeah, and prevents them from being able to interact with the world. It just completely, kind of stops them in their tracks.
Hmm.
That's why it's an anxiety disorder versus an just anxiety that they move through, is that they become dysfunctional in some way.
And so you're saying when it's generalized anxiety about something, it's sort of the same ideas that we always talk about, right? Is what you're saying is that it's to be curious and help them name the feeling of what's going on, acknowledge the feeling because, and I think this is what you're saying is that when this is true of so much that then if you have the ability to kind of talk through what's going on, that hopefully that anxiety will dissipate. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. And it will become more clear to the person who's experiencing the anxiety what the anxiety is specifically linked to, or if
Hmm.
it's kind of untethered and not linked to anything. And that's important because if it's a generalized anxiety disorder, if it's actually diagnosable as a disorder, there's it's a truism that if I could remember who I heard it from or read it from, I'd give them proper credit. But anxiety lies.
Hmm.
Anxiety lies. So when you have an anxiety disorder, it's like having this little thing on your shoulder whispering
Sure.
whispering to you, and saying, "Oh, well, yeah, that's something to be anxious about." Well, yep, nope, the world's definitely going to end tomorrow. Oh no, better not walk outside, could get hit by a car. I
Hmm.
mean, it says these things and catastrophizes,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Normal life. And that's the disordered part of it, right? If your child is having the anxiety about a test, right? That's normal. I mean,
Hmm.
of course you have an anxiety about a test. If your child is worried that a bomb is going to drop on them, if they live in the United States, right? That they're worried that a bomb is going to drop on them. That's anxiety lying to you
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
the likelihood is so low.
Right. I mean, I have my own experience with this, and my daughter has some experience with this. A lot of times for me, and I'm sure a lot of people have this experience. Like sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and you start ruminating on things, and suddenly you're out of. For me, it's always about, and I don't know how you teach this to a child, but it's almost like cognitive self talk because I've caught myself in the middle of the night going like, Greg, it's 3 a.m. What are you doing? It's kind of worrying about
Yeah.
everything that's down the road and what's not in front of you, what's not in your reality. And certainly at 3 a.m, it's like you're in bed. There's nothing you can do about this. It also starts to get extreme in your mind, and it is
Yes.
about, I guess that it just makes me think when you say anxiety lies because, I have to literally catch myself sometimes and say, this is not real. This is all projection. Um,
Mhm.
it might happen that yeah, this idea that I agree it does lie. You start worrying about things that are down the road that aren't happening right there in this in your life and what's happening in the moment. And for me, that's a lot about what it is. Worrying about all this
Mhm.
projection. I mean, would you say that's something you would talk to the child about when they're worrying about something that hasn't happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing is, and here's, you said at the beginning that you imagine that it's kind of a balance, and there's no question that it's a balance because we want to explain to kids that anxiety lies. And we also want to tell them how to reduce their anxiety.
Mhm.
And I want to talk about that in just a second. But at the same time, we don't want that message to be combined with, oh, you shouldn't feel anxious,
Right, right. Well, that's
right?
just going to make a person feel more anxious. Well, and it's
Right.
like we've talked about a million times, shoving away those feelings, they're just going to come out somewhere else. So you have to acknowledge them, right?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I encourage parents to not only think about, but talk about with their kids is, and we did a podcast on this as well, the idea of mental load, right? So, mental load is the things that we keep track of, right, in our heads. And sometimes they're logistical things like what do we need to buy at the store? And sometimes they're uh, things that have time constraints. Oh, I have to remember that I need to balance the checkbook later today and that kind of thing. One of the things that, and I was talking about this with a mom earlier today, even, is that kids today have a lot more stressors
Yeah.
than certainly than I did. And in particular, this mom has a college age kid, and just to think about that age group for a minute,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know, instead of just going to 4 years of college, and I mean, I loved college. I enjoyed the heck out of myself in college. I
Mhm.
took a bunch of different subjects. I was curious. I worked in the summers, at the local, bar or whatever as a waitress. Um, but kids today, there's a lot more pressure on them. It's all about, finding the internship for the summer and starting now to find the internship for next
Yep.
summer
Yep.
and focusing on a career by your freshman year, the end of your freshman year in college, as opposed
Mhm.
to, experiencing the college environment and kind of that, what I might say, that last little bit of freedom before we become tied down to things like mortgages and jobs and parenting and that kind of thing. But that's not true for kids today. So there are more stressors, and what that means is there are more balls in the air. There's more mental load.
Mhm.
Right? So they're having to think about, oh, I need to apply to this for next year. I need to sign up for these classes. By this time, I need to work on my roommate. This mom was saying that, for a junior in college, they had to make already had or a rising junior, they were having to make decisions about their senior roommate, who they would be roommates with in their senior year. I mean, that's a lot to be thinking of. And so that mental load, right, is the
Mhm.
equivalent of, juggling a
Sure.
bunch of balls in the air. When you're juggling, it's very difficult to address one of those things at a
Mhm.
time, right? Because they're it's like, oh my gosh, I've got to do this and I've got to do that and I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And oh, did I remember to do this? Have I forgotten about that? So one of the ways to alleviate some of that anxiety is to pull those balls out of the air and write them down. Then
Mm.
you're not having to remember. So that
Sure.
it's that middle of the night thing that you're talking about.
Yep.
We wake up, go, oh no, I have to remember it's so and
Mhm.
so's birthday,
Mhm.
down the line, and they're already mad that I missed it last year, you know, and it starts going in our heads and gets added to, and potentially catastrophized. But if it's written down, it's easier to deal with it, and that relieves that part of the stress.
Yeah, I mean, just personally, there's two things that have really helped me is that I have started to write lists because a lot of times, yeah, that's part of my own anxiety is waking up in the middle of the night and going, well, am I going to remember this? And so I really try to do that now every night. So I know if I do wake up and start to think, I go, I know I have that written down. Um,
Mhm.
I also started, and this is for maybe parents whose kids have, because one of my kids has a sleep issue is I started leaving my phone outside of my room a long time ago. And that also made a big difference because, you've already mentioned electronics. Wow, that one is such a big challenge, but kids are often on their phones, till the end of the night, and I think that can affect and increase anxiety. So that's always a battle, but I think that's
Yeah.
something for parents to look at. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying too is with this mental load, when they have so many things going on, is to kind of check in with them about each thing. And maybe I'll share this anecdote because this is kind of ironic. My middle daughter, who's 17, has had some sleep issues, and maybe I'll share this, and then you can tell me if we handled this correctly, because I think this is what you're talking about in terms of whether this is a disorder. Are you acknowledging it? Are you dealing with it correctly? So she is in the college process, which is intense anyway. And I think in New York City,
Hmm.
it's extra intense. So she's had anxiety from that. And she's actually leaving in 2 days for South Africa. So
Oh,
tomorrow,
wow.
tomorrow she's flying to South Africa for an internship for a month. And she's 17. It's going to be in Cape Town. And obviously she's excited, but she's also nervous. And last night at about 2 a.m, she came up to our room. It might have been 2:30, and she said, "I can't sleep. I can't sleep."
Mm.
We've had a few of these moments, and so I just got out of bed. And we've done this a few times, where I'm like, "You sleep in our bed, and I'll go get in your bed," because I just knew like she wasn't going to sleep. She was gonna be up all night if I didn't do that. Now. We have been checking in with her too about this trip. Like, how are you feeling? This is, you know what I mean, during the week.
Mhm.
But I think
Mhm.
because it's so close that last night she probably started getting caught up in the anxiety and she's traveling by herself and she's taking like 4 flights. And so for me, and you tell me this, I mean, obviously you don't want your 17-year-old child getting into your bed every night. And I think if we did that over and over, you're like, this is an issue because that can't go on. But yes,
Right.
once in a while when she's having a rough night, we're like, it's okay. And
Yeah.
I guess is that what you're talking about in the balance? So and so what we try to do, and we're not perfect about it, but I think this is what we're talking about. So like with my daughter specifically, who has sleep issues around anxiety, I think it's a lot. It's college, it's traveling, it's probably social relationships, it's all sorts of things. Is that we continue to try to check in, and teenagers, as we've talked a million times on this podcast, don't always want to talk. But she's been pretty good, obviously, about talking about like South Africa, that we continue to say and more talk about the feelings. And it's not about putting them on the couch, but saying like, wow, this is coming. How are you feeling? But
Mhm.
even in doing that, I think she got overwhelmed. I haven't spoken to her today, and I'll check in to say like, hey, what was going on last night?
Yeah.
But yeah, there's some nights, and last night was one of them. I knew. I'm like, I'm just gonna go down. I just said to her, I just got up. I said, go to bed, get in bed with mom, and I'll go sleep in your bed. And she, of course, and this
Mhm.
happens every time too. She falls asleep in 2 minutes. You know.
Right.
So I don't
Well,
know.
and
Is that is that is that the
there's
idea?
comfort, you know. So
What would you say?
I would say there's a difference between a 17-year-old and a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old, right?
Yeah.
Because for a younger child, saying, okay, you can come get in my bed because you're having trouble sleeping, it sends the message that they're not capable of handling sleeping by themselves.
Right.
And especially when a younger child is saying, I'm feeling scared. I'm scared. What are you scared of? Monsters, you know. And the parent says, well, come on into my bed, thinking it's
Right.
going to be a one-time deal. The
Sure.
problem is that the parent has just validated that there are monsters. They're not validating the feeling, they're validating a non-reality.
Well, and they're also
But
like, I
yeah,
think you're also saying that they're also now setting up this idea that they are not capable of working through this and staying in their bed and sleeping. I'm sure there's
exactly.
I'm glad you brought up the age, because I'm sure there's a million parents that struggle with that issue, right? The
Oh,
3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7-year-old child that wants to get in bed with the parent every night because they're scared.
yeah, I deal with it multiple times per week in my practice. And, and it's astonishing to me what kids can convince their parents of at these younger ages. But I'm really scared. I have to sleep with you. And of course, then it can become a real anxiety over time because the parents basically saying, yeah, you're not capable of handling this feeling. You're
Mm-hmm.
not capable of handling. So there, and the big difference here, right? Aside from chronological age, between, a younger child and a 17-year-old, is that, the 17-year-old is able to express that there's a thing in particular, and the parents know there's a thing in particular that's creating this anxiety. I mean, I find it anxiety producing to travel, and I'm,
Mm-hmm.
way more than 17 years old. So it's understandable. That's anxiety that's linked to a specific circumstance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you said, "Hey, I get it," and we can talk it all through tomorrow, but the easiest thing for you to get sleep right now is just to climb into this bed and have the comfort of mommy.
Right.
There's
Right.
nothing wrong with that. It's problematic when it's younger,
Right.
and it would be problematic if at
If
17 they were doing that every night.
right, right, 5 nights a week. Yeah, no, it would be weird.
That'd be problematic.
But yeah, I just
Yeah,
knew I'm like, she's leaving. I want her to get some rest. And
of
like I said, we have some
course.
experience this with her where it's come up around testing. And so yeah, once in a while I'm like, I get it. Let's just do it so you can sleep. And I know you have to get up in 4 hours, so get some rest.
Exactly. There's nothing wrong with that. And that can be a very validating experience for them, for them to know that mom and dad are willing to make an accommodation in that particular case.
Mm-hmm.
It's again, and I want to reiterate this, it's when the accommodations happen over and over and over and over again, whether it's a young child or an older child. If every day or, every third day, it's something like, I can't do that. Will you do that for me? It just
Mm-hmm.
makes me too anxious to take my plate to the sink.
Right,
I
right.
can't, will you do that for me? And the parents keep that accommodation in place, in spite of the fact that it's clear that the child is at a developmental stage when they can complete whatever the task is, that we begin to look at is this an anxiety disorder, or B, is the child playing the parent?
Well, I keep thinking we did an episode maybe a month ago about resiliency. We had a guest on who talked about resiliency with your kids and how to build resiliency. I think everyone should listen to that. But she told a story about her
Yeah.
own daughter, her own high school daughter, calling from school and saying, "I'm
Mhm.
sick." And the nurse
Mhm.
calling, and she knew that it was about anxiety and said, "I'm not coming to pick you up." And even
Yeah.
this, I think the school was like, "What?" And she was like, "I won't pick you up." She made it through that day. I think the next day it happened again, and I think the school was really pressing her to come get the child. And
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
guest was like, I'm sorry." She was polite about it, and I think she finally said, I think like the headmaster of the school called, and who got it, because I think what the mother said to this headmaster was, "If I come and pick her up, she will call me every day and not get through this." And I think that's kind of the idea that we're talking about. And I also feel like,
Mhm.
and you've already said this all is kind of complex and nuanced, and it really depends on the circumstance. But that's part of
Yeah.
it, is like, how do you build, how do you, and you tell me, because it seems like it's a combination of showing up for the feelings, being curious, making sure you're talking through what's going on, but not also picking them up every time to help them, because that's not going to give them, the resiliency, enable them to work through it on their own, right? So is that the balance you're
Mhm.
always trying to strike?
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. And and recognizing when maybe, or if maybe, they've tipped over from plain old anxiety to an anxiety disorder, right?
Hmm.
Because there are chemicals in our bodies that can be off kilter and perpetuate or create anxiety for people. And, the best way to determine if it's anxiety or an anxiety disorder is to, go to somebody and get an actual diagnosis,
Hmm.
one way or the other, because there are people for whom medication is necessary. And I find a lot of parents who come to me are very wary of that medication. And, listen, I don't think we should be medicating unnecessarily. I
Sure.
agree with being, let's take the approach of let's see if other things work first. But the reality of medication for somebody who has an anxiety disorder, one of the arguments that parents make is either it's going to rob them of all emotion, right? They
Hmm.
just won't feel anything anymore. Or it's going to, maybe it'll solve the problem. So I think it's important for parents to understand it and be clear about this. Anxiety medication doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
Anxiety medication levels the playing field so that the child can solve the problem. So I like to think about it as, if you're out in the middle of the ocean, you have to get to shore, right?
Hmm.
But you're in the middle of the ocean and you're being knocked about by waves and you're dog paddling just to stay afloat. You're
Hmm.
too exhausted to be able
Right.
to get to the shore. What medication does is it brings the ocean floor up
Hmm.
so that you're now standing. You're
Hmm.
still in the middle of the ocean. You still have to get to shore. You still have to figure out how to manage anxiety. But now you have solid footing. You can catch your breath and you can do the work.
Well, can I just say, because I just think I just want to reiterate this, and this is from my own experience with kids in general. I think it's so important what you're saying, because I've always been a proponent of medication when it's needed, whether it's depression,
Yeah.
anxiety, but to me, it can never be just one. The medication can definitely
Hmm.
help, but to me, it's got to be in a combination with talk therapy, and that's what I think. What you're saying is, because if someone has chronic anxiety, and if you find like your child literally is incapacitated, so then it's obvious it has an anxiety disorder. You're not going to have any ability. No person will have any ability to kind of try to look at like what are the underlying things that are causing this. So yeah, I think medication. And I
Hmm.
yeah, and I agree that that's what it's about, is the medication can help stabilize the child, that then you can have, okay, now I'm in a place that at least I can talk through this where I'm going. Oh yeah, and I was going to say I agree, it's never to be taken lightly. Like you have to talk to
Yeah.
doctors and talk to the child and see what it is, and it can't be by itself, because you're right, it doesn't
Hmm.
fix it. It's going to help, and it's going to kind of cover it, but there's always underlying psychological stuff that's going on. So to me, it's a combination. Like if your child,
Yeah.
and please let me know, like tell me what you think of what I'm saying, but this idea that if it's chronic, if it's severe, if it's ongoing, that they can take medication to get it stabilized, but then it's about going to talk therapy and having it be a combination of the two things to help deal with it.
Yeah, it has to be the combination of the two things. You can't rely on the medication alone because that's not going to, using the ocean analogy, it's not going to bring you closer to shore. It's going to help you catch your breath. And that's
Hmm.
great, right? And sometimes medication has to be long term. Sometimes it has to be ongoing when there is a disorder, and that's okay too. It doesn't mean just because you're on medication doesn't mean you're not doing the work.
Right.
And ideally, doing that work with a therapist is going to be, the best thing that you can do because, the work exists. And one of the things that, the other thing that I talk to parents about is, are there specifically the feeling of anxiety triggers a fight, flight, or freeze response. And something can trigger that anxiety. In other words, there can be an outstanding event in your life that later in life you come to a similar moment or a similar circumstances, and that history
Hmm.
informs that feeling of anxiety that you have in a different moment in time that creates that fight, flight, or freeze. So, one of the things that talk therapy does is that it helps you reflect back on your history
Mm-hmm.
so that you begin to understand what things trigger, so
Right,
that you
right.
can, right? So that in that moment, you have the anxiety. And this is true for kids too. Kids are completely capable of having these insights, right? You have the anxiety, you say, oh, I recognize this.
Mm-hmm.
This is the
Mm-hmm.
feeling of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
What am I anxious about? Is there something
Name the
specific that I can
Yeah,
point to?
name the feeling, right.
And yeah, and name the feeling. Is there a specific circumstance? Oh yeah, I have a test coming up. Or no, I just feel anxious. So then that allows you to stop and say, okay, well, what just happened that might have triggered this feeling for me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
What historical thing am I bringing to this picture?
yeah, I think that's great. I think that's the idea, is that hopefully you start to develop some tools in your toolbox, so then when it comes up again, you're able to do it. The other thing I want to add is it's easy, and I feel this is true because I feel like in New York City it's easy to talk about therapy, medication, mental health. I think there's big
Mhm.
swaths of the country where that's still somehow a stigma, like you have to be crazy to go to therapy, or you must be nuts to, take medication. And the reality is that I think if that stuff goes untreated, is that's when people, especially as teens, as kids get older, that they start to use drugs and alcohol to
Mhm.
manage it, right? And
Yeah.
I think talk therapy and medication can be a healthier way to kind of deal with it, because if you don't do it, you're going to find something, whether it's food or sex, drugs, alcohol. So that's why it's another reason I think, and you tell me how you feel, is that it's important to address it, because if you don't, it, you're gonna find something, because if it's an unbearable feeling, you're gonna find something to help mute it and numb it.
Mhm. Yeah, there's no question that people self-medicate when they don't have appropriate medication or appropriate channels to talk about and work through, the things that they're having negative feelings about. And in the study that I mentioned at the beginning that said that there's been a significant rise in anxiety and depression in the last 5 years for kids between 3 and 17 years old. What's interesting and very sad is that that is not reflected in a rise in seeking out,
Help,
therapy.
right?
Yeah, seeking out help. And sadly, I think we're seeing more suicides, more suicidal ideation, more self harm. And those are the ways that kids are trying to deal with this because they're not being channeled into appropriate therapeutic situations that could be
W-
helpful for them.
What do you think that's about, though? Is that why aren't kids and parents reaching out? Is that part of being a stigma somehow around seeking help? Is you're weak? Is that part of it?
Oh, yeah. I think that there's a huge stigma around, mental health, awareness of how that how mental health, we go to the doctor for an annual physical, right? Physical
Sure.
health is important. We go to the doctor for an annual physical. If something's hurting physically, our elbow, our head, our stomach, we seek out physical treatment for it.
Mm-hmm.
Mental health, nobody goes for a check-in once a year,
Right.
right? To see how they're doing. Nobody, if they're in emotional pain, I mean, very few people. I'm not going to say nobody because that's ridiculous. That's it's hyperbole, right? But far fewer people are willing to go and get their mental health checked by,
Mm-hmm.
by a counselor, or if they are in mental pain to go to a counselor. And it is, Greg, it's a stigma. It's like if you seek out treatment for mental pain, you're weak. If you seek out treatment for physical pain, you're just being smart. We still have a stigma.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is that when you start to dig a little bit, or you get to know people, everyone is struggling, like, with stuff, and
Yeah.
that's okay. It's kind of life. This idea that no, we're all fine, and it's better that the more we can kind of put it out there, I think the better. So why don't we just wrap up as we usually do? If you reflect on the conversation we just had, are there a couple of things you would say to parents to keep in mind if their child is showing signs of anxiety and or an anxiety disorder?
Yes, the first thing that I would say to parents is whether or not you decide to seek professional help or a professional opinion about whether this is normal, quote unquote, anxiety or an anxiety disorder, you have to validate your child's feeling. You have to say, you seem anxious. I see that you're being triggered by something or that you're being bothered by something. And is there anything I can do to help? I think that is the primary role that parents play. Ideally, if you're concerned or unsure about whether your child is having, typical anxiety versus an anxiety disorder, seek out that help, because the big problems happen when kids self-medicate. And when I talk about that, I don't mean that it's a decision between, I go to the doctor and the doctor says, yeah, you have an anxiety disorder and we're going to medicate you. That's not automatically the type of help that the child needs. But they may need somebody to support them in working through this stuff so that they don't, use drugs or sex or shopping. I hear that a lot, or
yeah, right.
self-harm.
It's hard. Yeah. Well, with Amazon, it's basically a floating mall. So I've had to watch that with my own kids because there's a comfort that goes around that too. So it's about checking in with those is to see when those things are going on. If it's, drinking or drugs or like you said, shopping, is like for parents to maybe wonder and be curious about and make sure, is there an underlying thing that's going on?
Yeah, exactly. And then also, I think maybe the third thing that I would say is the more in dialogue we can be with our kids, the better we are to support them no matter what happens, in their lives. And I think part of that is when we're talking about anxiety, I think it's important to talk about mental load and how sometimes just the simple act of, instead of carrying around the mental load and trying to remember everything that you need to do, sometimes just the simple act of writing it down in a list, right, can relieve you of enough of that piece of the stress to where you don't feel as anxious about the situation, because now you have them in an order. There's a little bit of a structure there. You can say, here's the time sensitive things that I have to take care of first. If at that point you still can't take care of them, then we go back to what's standing in the way. What's preventing you from being taking care of it? And it could be anxiety, that could be the thing that's preventing somebody from taking care of that list, whether it's the mental list or the physical list. I think if there's one kind of final thing that I'd like to say here is that the importance of being curious about your child's life, about what they're going through, about their feelings, without putting judgment on that, is of the utmost importance. It creates the dialogue that we need to have with our children and allows for, as Brenda Euland said, and I've quoted her before, she says that when we listen, ideas begin to come to life and to grow and to expand and ultimately to flower. So when we're listening, when we're approaching with curiosity to our kids, the ideas that we're seeking to alleviate whatever the feeling is, but in this case, we're talking about anxiety, have a chance to really grow and blossom. Thanks for listening to the Parenting Horizons podcast.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share with your family and friends. And if you'd like to hear more about Julie's work, join one of her parenting groups, or see about individual counseling, please visit parentinghorizons.com. Or you can email Julie at julie.ross@parentinghorizons.com.
See you next time.